welcome everybody to this session about architecture in the city. I'm going to introduce them all in a moment, but I thought we might start given... I need to tell you about those images up there before we do anything else. All of those amazing pictures that you can look at when you're tired of looking at us are by John Gollings, who's a wonderfully well-known architectural photographer. And they were recently exhibited at a World Architecture Congress in South Africa, and you will be able to find them on the Architects Institute website. I'm not quite sure when, but I would have thought pretty much straight away. They are all images of Melbourne and of various bits of extraordinary design in Melbourne. The thing about this topic was I looked at it and I thought architecture in the city, well, maybe it should be architects in the city, because I'm not sure how many of you came along to hear David Giannotin from OMA talk on Monday. But I thought a lot of what he had to say was really to question the role of the architect. What does an architect do? And he said one thing that really stayed with me, which was, architecture is a kind of conversation in which questions are asked, but maybe the point of it is to question the question. So I think what we'll do tonight is try and put some questions to our expert panel and see if they are actually the right questions. But I've got a question that I want them all to think about. You'll see the blood drain from their faces and they put their thinking caps on. But the question that I think maybe, and you can all think about this as well, because I assume that you're here because you're aficionados of the architecture in this city, is where would we rate Melbourne on a global scale as an architectural city? 1 to 10, 0 is not acceptable. You can't go negative, and I'm not accepting any decimal points either. There's sort of an extended Brownlow system here. So have a think about that. Our panel is also thinking about that. And the second part of it might be, because it feels like we are at a moment in time with architecture in this city, what would the answer be in 10 years' time? If the answer today is X, would it be less than X or more than X? In other words, are we getting better or worse? Maybe the architect not only has a design role but a social role, but it feels to me like the idea of what a city is changing very dramatically. And there's that wonderful factoid, which I'm sure some of you know, that for the first time in history, more than half of the world's population now lives in cities, and even as population growth slows, that percentage, which is now above 50, is going to get higher and higher. So is the word city going to work anymore? Do we need some other word which deals with the urban nature of the way that we live? If you've ever gone on a long flight at night and you look down and you see all those lights and you see them pouring into other lights a little bit further along, and you suddenly realise that maybe the way we live now, the principle of organisation that traditionally has gone into a city, is now extending out and sprawling out. So that's given them a little bit of thinking time. Let me just quickly introduce them, and maybe they'll have a little bit more to say about what they do as they answer this question. On my far left, on the other side of the panel, is John Clements, who's a very well-known architect and has won a lot of awards. Now I'm going to go to my notes because I'd rather get his bio. I could do a fictional biography. I'm a book publisher after all. Now that I think of that, that's very tempting. John's one of the founding directors of Jackson Clements Burrows, which is now nearly 20 years old. It was established in 1998. It's quite a big firm. It's in the city. It employs around 40 architects and designers. Now, most importantly, John is the current president-elect of the Australian Institute of Architects. And I did a tiny bit of Google work, I have to confess, before I came here. And he gave a speech, I think, a little while ago, in which he complained that, or lamented, shall I say, that it might be the case that our respect for architects is diminishing. And why is that? Architects, in the face of pressure from urban planners and developers, starting to lose their mojo and cut corners. Then I turned to Kerstin Thompson, who has her own firm, which is Kerstin Thompson Architects. It's been around for 20 years, since 1994. Kerstin's a professor, so pay attention when she speaks. She's the Professor of Design at the School of Architecture at Victoria University in Wellington and an Assistant Professor at the RMIT. And she's done a lot of award-winning buildings, and you can find them all online if you want to, including the Monash University Museum of Art reasonably recently. Then Rodney Eggleston, and the Google work was very satisfying with Rodney, I have to say, because he's got design genes, I discovered, in every sense, because I read today that his mother once designed a pair of jeans for Lou Reed, and I just thought that was so extraordinarily cool.
Good Googling.
For those of you who were here to hear David Giannotten, Rodney has worked for Rem Koolhaas at OMA in Rotterdam for a couple of years. And in 2007, he founded March Studio, which is in North Melbourne, with his partner Anne-Laure Cavagnou. And it's a multifaceted architecture and design studio and does all sorts of interesting things with digital technologies. And then sitting next to me is Shelley Penn, and she hangs out in Williamstown. And look, Shelley has done a lot of architecture, but she's given bucket loads of advice, I discovered, to government and to the private sector about architecture. And frankly, the government that she hasn't advised hasn't been elected yet. And Shelley's just dropped a bombshell on us, which is that she's now been pre-selected for the Labor Party to run for the Senate at the next federal election. So give it up for Shelley. But Shelley has sat on a lot of boards and influential committees. She's given a huge amount of advice to a whole lot of people. And perhaps one of the most important things she does right now is she's chair of the National Capital Authority, which I guess looks after Burley Griffin's vision in Canberra. So you've had a lot of time to think, guys. And shall we start with Kerstin?
Sure. Thank you. Well, rating. I hate doing ratings and I hate giving things numbers out of whatever, but I would give Melbourne a 9 for its A-grade buildings, and by A-grade I mean the sort of special one-offs, its museums, its design hubs, those buildings that we generally accept as a place for architecture. I'd probably give it about a 5 or a 6 for its B-grade. And when I say B-grade, I mean the everyday stuff. And I think that's where we could hugely improve and remind ourselves that it's also where architecture needs to happen. It's not just for those special things. So my concern is that in the next 10 years, the B grade might keep dropping from a 6 to maybe a 3 if we're not really careful. And Shelley, the pressure will be on to get some things in our system to make sure that, for example, things like Fisherman's Bend and all sorts of other massive opportunities for city development as a collection of buildings, not just fabulous one-offs, gets lost. And so that's how I'd rate Melbourne right now.
Okay, well, I took that as an average of 7. I'm not sure about you.
No, I'd say really bad or really good.
And trending downwards. Rodney.
Interesting question, and I've just sort of sat here blankly the whole time since you asked it, but I think Melbourne's a 10, and it always has been a 10. We, as Melburnians, have always had the ability to go the extra step, find that extra kind of layer, work those extra hours. There's a pride in our city. We don't have a beach that we can go to and just go surfing, so we're kind of locked in our studios to do fantastic work. Of recent times, and I think Melbourne's created trends, created fashions, and it's because of contextualisation we've done that. And this goes way back to the 50s and earlier. Where do we go from here after, we're in a different world these days where we're on blogs, we're on the internet, everything starts looking like itself. Mm-hmm. How do we respond, and how do we not become susceptible to trend when we've always been creating and responding contextually? So in the future, I sort of hold my breath and think, with looking at all the buildings that are going up, is it just a race to the bottom, or are we going to look back into the city and try to create something that's typically Melbourne?
And Shelley, where do you stand mathematically?
Probably a 7 overall as well, although I know you said no decimals, but I probably actually would say 7.8.
You try and keep it simple and you forget you're up here with architects.
There's a reason. It's because I guess I was thinking immediately, you think, how do we rate Melbourne architecture? And so I was thinking the buildings, of course, that's where your mind goes. And I agree with Kerstin and Rodney, we've got fantastic buildings. We have many fantastic buildings. We also have quite a lot of ordinary ones. But and they are probably they do put us up at the 9, but for me it's more about the whole bag, how it all hangs together. And I think I pull it down a bit because we've got plenty of places that are not great. And what I mean by places is not just the buildings, but those places that are actually not great places to be. And I'm saying 7.8, not just 7, because I think we've started to do some fantastic things in public realm. So places like Lonsdale Street, Dandenong, the work that's been done there over the last several years is absolutely fantastic. And if you haven't been out there, you should go, not just because they've restored what was a sort of a highway into a strip shopping centre again, but because they've got one of the best markets in the world. But I think we're actually getting up there again because we're starting to do public space incredibly well, and that just is this other layer of richness. The City of Melbourne's been doing it for a long time and extremely successfully, which you've all experienced, but I think we're doing it more broadly. So Greater Melbourne is growing. So I think we've got a way to go with that, but that's the exciting part for me. We have to keep doing fantastic architecture, and we have to keep nurturing that. And I also agree with Kerstin that if we don't, we'll tail down again. But I think it's the extra layer of public space that makes it sort of richer. So
I think we're doing pretty well so far. We've got a 10, a 7, and I'm rounding Shelley up to an 8. I hope she doesn't mind that. John?
They're all pretty high scores. I'm probably going to buck the trend, and I'm not going to give Melbourne a score. I'm going to say that Melbourne's the underdog. And I would put a bet on the underdog in this circumstance. I think what's fantastic about Melbourne, and I suppose I can speak from my experience and maybe even talking to Rod to some degree, and Kerstin and Shelley, I mean, we're all young architects. If you look at perhaps the age of architects that are highly respected within the community overseas. And Melbourne does provide, through its youthful nature as a city, this incredible opportunity for young architects. And I think some of the most creative work, and a lot of it's behind us at the moment, has come from the fact that the city, and even the city's planners, are actually embracing young architects and the way they approach the sort of problems within the city and the architecture within the city in a far more creative and energised way. And that's with no disrespect to our sort of more senior practitioners who've left a great legacy on the city. But I really believe there's a lot to look out for coming forwards in Melbourne, but I also think that as young architects, we're also in very, very challenging times in terms of the planning environment. And I suppose if I try and capture that in a space, and maybe even turning to Kerstin's comments when you talk about the A-grade buildings, the A-grade buildings in Melbourne are fairly small. They're not. It's not about the tall architecture in Melbourne, and we've always been quite an understated city, and I don't think that we need to be an extremely tall city. That's not a blanket statement about the fact that towers are being approved at the moment, but our fantastic architecture is at that small scale. It's between 1 and 5 stories, and it's actually quite incredible the quality of the work that we're producing. And the images that you see tonight, which are behind us, were presented at the UIA conference only a couple of weeks ago in Durban, where Melbourne bid for the UIA conference for 2020. And we were really going out on a limb as the Institute to make a bid for that Congress, which would have brought about 5,000 architects to Melbourne. And I will confess that we lost the bid, and we lost the bid to Rio after semi-naked dancing girls came onto the stage and put effectively the soccer bid forward as an architecture bid. Yeah. And I will say as well that the bulk of the people who are making the decision were 65-year-old men. So we shouldn't feel bad about what we put forwards. But I can say that, and my business partner Graham Burrows, along with Jill Garner, were two of the people who presented the bid. But the response that they got from these international architects about Melbourne was absolutely incredible. They couldn't believe the work that they saw on the screen, couldn't believe that Melbourne was producing architecture at that level, and it's still a bit undiscovered. And when I say that, we do have an international recognition, but we are seriously just sitting in the undertone at the moment, and we'll be highly recognised soon.
I just want to respond to that, the idea of the underdog. I mean, I think what you say is exactly right, but interestingly, I think we're recognised, certainly within Australia, for being ahead. And I was asked recently, to meet with some people who are basically running the delivery of a major piece of infrastructure in another state, and they came and sort of sat down. There was a project director, a procurement guy and a lawyer, and the questions were, do you mind, we just want to talk to you because Melbourne does it so well. Can you just tell us how do you do it? You know, what do we need to do? And they were talking about writing a brief for a major bit of infrastructure and all that kind of the process involved. And I sort of thought, well, what is it? It's cultural. It's deeply cultural. And I think that is something that we have that's embedded. So it doesn't mean we can't do better and support young architects, as you say, but it's about rigour, how we do things. It doesn't mean we get everything right, we get heaps wrong. But how we approach things. Another example is a very well-known Melbourne architect said to me a couple of years ago, we just had a phone call from ex-contractors who are doing this huge project in Sydney, and they said when they rang us, we thought we'd better get a Melbourne architect because they've got design quality high on their criteria. So, you know, what does that say? That's fantastic. They recognise that's what we do here. We value it here, and we've got great capability here. Yeah,
I do want to come back to the cultural question because I think it's really interesting. But can we just explore for a minute the tensions between, Kerstin, your response and John? Because John, I just sense tremendous optimism in the way that you were speaking. A group of young architects really emerging, very energised design, and yet if you read the newspaper, it's all about tall towers, 100,000 people extra coming to live in the city every year. How are we going to house them? What are the pressures on planning and design going to be? So how are we going to maintain that very high standard, even if it's only selective, in the face of these tremendous pressures on the city?
Yeah, I mean, I think the standard, to some degree, has to be improved by bringing standards in. And I mean, recently we've had this, as many people maybe in the room are aware, we had the leak of the Government Architect's Office design standards, and that's sort of become a hot potato politically, and it's been put to one side for the second while we lead into an election. And without getting into the debate about what the standards should be, I think that the idea about introducing standards and the importance of, for example, the Government Architect's Office and the role that they play in educating the government sector particularly, but also the public into believing in standards and believing in better buildings is really important. I mean, if we look at Sydney, for example, they had the introduction of SEP 65 in, I think, 2002 or 3.
Introduction of what?
SEP 65, which is basically planning standards for apartment buildings as a result of a real deterioration in the standards that were occurring in response to the market.
It's legislation that mandates that any residential apartment building over, I think, three stories has to be designed by an architect. Some people would say that's protectionist, yes, of the quality of the outcome. And it's not about getting masterpieces, it's about eliminating the dross, getting a basic standard that's good.
I think to understand it, like it's easy as an architect to say we need standards and we should mandate the use of architects, but I mean you have to look at it in a balanced way anyway. But they introduced those standards, and there was a bit of a knee-jerk response from the market, and they really struggled with the standards for a while. But it's been proven over the course of time now, after about 3 or 4 years, the standards settled in. And the quality of the buildings that were being built and the amenity and standards within those buildings significantly improved. And the market followed it, because if there's standards, the market has to adapt. So it's not about saying, but the market want 40 square metre single bedroom apartments with bedrooms that don't have windows or ventilation and so forth.
That's the point. I think it's government's job to set the agenda and be very clear about what that is. And industry is very, very smart. And if the rules are clear, industry will very cleverly innovate and adapt to it. If the rules keep changing, it's very difficult for everybody, and you get poor outcomes.
So I guess, just coming back to the question though, the idea of having legislated standards and ideally, educated architects designing the buildings that have the biggest footprint on our city is very important. And architects can obviously provide more creative solutions to the density debate.
You can do that when you come into power.
Tall towers.
So, Kerstin, is that going to do the job? Are the commercial pressures that architects are going to have to work under in the future, is a set of standards going to guarantee quality, or do we need, is it education? What is it?
Look, it's a combination of things. I think architects are always working under commercial pressures. It's just a reality of what we do. And I actually think more credit, an acknowledgement of what we work with is probably important. But I think, yes, regulation would help enormously in that there's many examples where we might make a call, we might make a recommendation on, especially to do with amenity or quality of built environment, to a developer. And it's pretty difficult to not be told at, say, 7 o'clock on a Friday night, shut up and draw the value managed outcome, okay? So without regulation, we are pretty powerless to make changes that have a massive impact on the outcome. Now, we also know stories of where something gets built that we knew as architects, the quality might be compromised. We knew that there was a better solution possible, but for various reasons, that's not what manifest. You know the marginal capital outlay difference that might have been and the return that you might have got. For some reason, when architects say this stuff, it's not always heard, and then later on, the testament is there when people choose one type of space over another, because in the end I think people have a lot of intelligence of establishing what's a good space to live in, what is more livable, and they make their choices. And I think that's partly what we're seeing at the moment with certain sorts of developments which will be difficult longer term, and then the quality ones will stand out. So I think regulation helps to a point. I think that would certainly assist. And I also think we do have to be, as architects, very proactive about what we do and trying to influence for that change as well.
The other thing, though, is that, I guess I'm conscious of the images up behind us. There's a difference between what we're talking about now, which is good, decent buildings that have good basic amenity and just fundamentally look after people's needs, and a good basic infrastructure as opposed to building slums and ghettos. That's different from these sorts of buildings which are about innovation. And innovation is incredibly important, and that I don't think can be regulated. That has to be nurtured and fostered, and that's part of a culture. That's where, as John says, the Government Architect's Office is so important as an advocacy. I guess on the government side, as an advocacy tool. There are many other sort of vehicles and forms that nurture that as well, but they're necessary.
But I think that level of innovation with these sorts of buildings we see behind us will keep happening. It's and for many reasons. One goes back to Melbourne as an architectural culture and as a broader culture that is interested in good architecture and commissions good architecture. So there's lots of examples of that, and I think that part of it is sort of the easy part. And the thing that's amazing about Melbourne is, as a critical mass, there's a lot of good architects doing a lot of good work, and it really kind of, I think, pushes the level up. And you only need to go to sometimes smaller cities where you just don't have the same kind of peer argy-bargy, which I think is a massive part of what makes Melbourne very powerful. It's sort of architectural tribes. Anywhere where you have a number of different positions is incredibly powerful in terms of developing and growing and fostering a culture, whether it's literature or architecture or art. So I think in that respect we're very fortunate. It's just getting that great thinking that we know is there to, as we say, these sorts of other sorts of projects, those everyday ones.
Perhaps, I think what you seem to be speaking to here is that there isn't always a necessary tension between innovation and cost. And I might ask you, Rodney, just in terms of your own practice, how you found that. I was thinking as you were talking about that, I love that quote from Alan Shepard, who was, I think, the second man in space after Yuri Gagarin, and someone once asked him what he was thinking about as he sat in the spaceship ready to blast off into the atmosphere. And he said, I was reflecting on the fact that every component in this spaceship was supplied by the lowest bidder. And I just wonder, it must happen all the time in architecture, where there's an idea.
Absolutely, yeah, and there's always that temptation to kind of lowball it and go in a little bit lower than the next person and win the job. And we do compete on a number of levels, which is really difficult for architects in the city. So sometimes you're asked to do a design for nothing. You know, we usually say no, and then you also have to give a fee off it as well. Hang on a second, are we being picked on the fee or the idea, or what is this all about here? We've been fortunate that we've carved out a little kind of area that we can say that we're good at doing, I guess. And as a result, if we can specialise more in certain areas, then you attract a certain type of client that wants a certain type of product. And especially in what we're doing, where we're working with design that's becoming a commercial viability as well. So our clients have realised that actually, rather than giving a whole lot of money to an advertiser, I can build something beautiful and it can get a certain type of traction out of it. Design is becoming, again, in the scale of work that we work in, and also with some of these developments at the kind of top end, a commodity again, which I think is really important. So we've been fortunate to be in that position, and I think that it just takes everybody to not be tempted by sacrificing anything. And I think John's got a bit to say about this, because aren't we going to get a cartel going where we fix prices from now on?
How many architects are in the room? I do think there's an interesting debate there, and I don't want tonight's conversation to descend into talking about development work. But I think in the space, when we think about the planning system that we have here, that the architect has, to some degree, been devalued and has become a means to an end. And in that sense, I say that we need a planning permit to achieve a solution, and that is where there's control in the planning system. And so you need, for example, if you say you had a site and you have a height limit, or it may not be a mandated height limit, but a recommended height limit of 4 stories, and that site might be suited to a building of 6 or 8 stories if it's designed well. And there's an opportunity there to increase the density in the city without having a lot of impact on the surrounding neighbours, if it's designed well. And the architect becomes key to that solution, that an architect can come up with a creative solution for that building that's taller, that still respects the neighbourhood, appropriately responds to its context, can achieve a permit. But as soon as you get that permit granted, that permit resides with the site. It doesn't reside with the architect. So, the development market are now going out to the creative architects and looking for a fee to get a planning permit. And they don't even want to entertain a discussion about whether you will design and detail and deliver that building in terms of the story that you actually sold to both the council and the adjoining owners and neighbours and so forth. And we have this difficult problem in the system where the ownership of that permit and the design that goes with that permit actually resides with the site after the permit's approved.
I'm going to be devil's advocate here, actually, because I actually think if the worry I have is in that sort of scenario, yes, you get in a decent architect to help you get the permit. Now, I actually think that could work if what the architect was doing the really good bones of the project. So if it was about neighbourly relations, how do we want to live beside each other in high density? They're sort of important issues, and architecture deals with that. What kind of diversity of dwelling might happen? Yes, all the neighbourhood stuff you're talking about, they're kind of the big picture issues that any building needs to deal with. Whether we do the granite benchtop, who cares, frankly? And this is part of the problem, is that architects have been...
Controversial, Kerstin.
Well, so my point would be this. I would happily be involved to get the right bones, the right layout, the right light, the right amenity, the right mix, get the right form, and then if someone wants to offload me and get someone to do the fit out, that's absolutely fine, because it's the other stuff that is the major place where we have a contribution to the city, and we've got too hung up on some of that end stuff.
I think that's right to a degree, but I guess I've just
I know how cynically it gets used, and we get to do the skin, and there's a lot of examples where all we get to do is a bit of cladding if we're lucky. And look, some people would argue cladding is everything in architecture. I don't share that thought. It's not enough.
I agree. I mean, I don't care about the benchtop either, but I do care about there is a quality and there's a level of resolution that does affect the public realm, which is the bit that I tend to be looking at. And
that's right.
and I've seen so many projects put forward by, let's say, lesser designers. And frankly, some are better than others. And there is just a world of difference between the way they get everything out of it the best they can in terms of minutes, synthesising all these complex issues and then get a fantastic public outcome. And so I guess I agree with you. I love that idea, but I just don't know if it really can work successfully.
But I think if it was a choice between us getting to choose the quality of the building shell, its relationship to its neighbour, its type of light, its outlook,
but that's what I'm talking about.
And what colour it's thing. You know,
isn't that what Res Code and the planning laws are designed to do to begin with?
I don't actually think they do.
They're not defined.
No.
But I think it's worth commenting for those that are not aware that the Government Architects Office have set up a design review panel, and that started with testing government projects. And in fact, in fairness to the government, which I thought was a great thing, was they started by looking at regional projects where generally the quality of architecture has been quite poor. There's either not architects in regional towns or the planners don't have a lot of experience or supportive advice in regional centres. And the Government Architects Office set up the design review panels to review those projects and assist the planners to get better outcomes. And that's now shifted across to private projects. But again, you know, in the lead up to an election, this is all sort of sitting out there and is a process that is questionable about whether it will continue.
I think it's a critical role. I mean, we were talking about legislation before. I established that office with John Denton, and we did the sort of forerunner of the Victorian Design Review Panel that's in place now by doing that stuff ourselves. And I firmly believe regulation cannot produce good design. All it does is protect minimum standards, and that's extremely important, and we have to make that really clear and put that in place. But you get good design by making a clear demand. So when it gets to, well, in public projects it's perhaps easier than in development, but you will always have a pricing competition, back to that point. But if you set the demand high enough and you're very clear that at minimum it has to be of a high quality, the process to judge it is going to involve expert review. The architect, the original architect, it has to stay with it through the process for delivery. What you might get is, instead of absolutely appalling, possibly acceptable and average, and then you get the cheapest one out of those. If you're lucky, it'll be the average, not the completely appalling. What you get instead, if the demand is right, is average, good and fantastic. So if the cheapest one happens to be average, that's a whole lot better than appalling, and that's about how you set the terms. That's public projects. I think that can apply with development, which is back to the cultural thing, and it's the point you made, Kerstin, about seeing the value of good design. That if developers are saying, actually, I'm getting a higher return for that block I did down the road and I did it well, people actually like the better space, bigger balconies and...
But isn't also the issue that the development doesn't even... I mean, no one ever sees the granite benchtop anymore. We're sort of building apartment after apartment after apartment, and then we're getting these occupancy rates, which, John, you probably know a figure, but they're not full buildings. So we're sort of creating these areas and then we're selling them off, and people are buying them as investments, and they're empty spaces. There could be nothing in it. They'd probably never know. So how do we then kind of rejuvenate areas?
Rod's right. I mean, there is investment coming from overseas in apartments, and they're not even renting them. So we've got a whole lot of empty apartments that are expensive apartments being built in large towers in Melbourne, and that's a fundamental issue when you get into the density debate, because on one side the government might say, we've just put another 3,000 homes in the Melbourne CBD, but are they being lived in, and are they contributing anything at all to the city itself and the culture of the city? Then there's another level where you sort of get into the lower scale density, and you actually look at the more complex solutions rather than just putting a whole lot of houses on.
And I think that's the key, and you pointed to that before, John, that we actually have enormous capacity for much more development, more people in this city without sprawl. We do not need to go further, but it's all about doing it well. We kind of 2 or 3 stories or high rise, and there's actually space for in between. People are afraid of development for good reason, because there's been a lot of appalling development. If we do it well, maybe it should be 4 stories in a particular context, or maybe 5 stories is okay, and it's not just about height, it's all of those other things. That's where I think you actually do need good design, because you need innovative solutions, so you get things that are responsive to heritage context, responsive to height issues, do give back in terms of public space. They don't have to go through to that level of the kitchen bench top, but there is a level of quality in the stuff you're talking about, Kerstin, and I think a little bit beyond that in terms of materials and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, look, absolutely. In an ideal world, of course, you'd get follow through, but I think it's just a question of priority sometimes, and different projects demand perhaps a different focus of, say, architectural intent.
Yeah.
And so it's just working out, especially with larger projects that do have a massive impact, and especially when you collect them, when there's a number of them. So it's where our efforts might be best placed to get the best outcome.
Yeah.
I was struck, John, by your comments about the potential devaluation of the role of the architect. I wonder whether the collective feeling of the panel is that architects need to do a better job of public advocacy of good architecture. I mean, here we are in the City of Literature in the Wheeler Centre, and I often feel that in the publishing industry we do a very poor job of explaining the value of the work that we provide and the paths that we find for writers. Do architects need to make a stronger case, and not just for basic standards of good design, but for the kind of extraordinary design and the images that, and this goes back to Shelley's point about a culture, that we are part of a culture. I can hear, listening to you all speak, that you have a very strong sense of the culture that you're coming out of. Do we need to make better arguments about that?
I think something like the Melbourne Open program, Open House,
yeah.
Thank you, I think is one of the best initiatives, because a great difficulty with architecture is that it is experiential. Where you're in it, you're not looking at it all the time, and yet it's very easy to communicate a looking at thing through an image, through the photograph. That's how most people come in contact with architecture, and I think it's probably the most limited way of understanding it. So the open house thing is where you open the doors of the city to good buildings, because really the best way to understand and advocate for good architecture is to experience it and to be in it. So initiatives like that get people in things. Of course, a one-off, 40 minutes in a beautiful space is quite different to living with it every day, and we know that people who do have that, whether it's because they have got an architect-designed house or office or whatever it is, it's incredibly rewarding to hear the pleasures and the joy that comes from that. But things like those sorts of initiatives, I think, are wonderful, because talking about it, there is a limit to how much we can talk about what is great or valuable.
There's also a bit of an image problem. I mean, there's an image problem, which is the fact, well, there is a fact that most, it's a relatively elite kind of field in terms of, say, residential architecture, where it's only a small percentage of the population that can, or do, not necessarily can actually, but do tend to use architects. That doesn't have to be the case. Architects have worked in all sort of manner and all scale and all budget of architecture for years. In fact, most architects work on very tiny budgets, particularly when they start off and do very clever things with innovation. There's a real role for that. There's a real need for that in low-cost housing. But we still have an image problem where we perhaps don't help with that. We're seen as being elite, and I think actually most architects I know don't want to be elite. They just want to make good outcomes, whether they're high end or else they're working in better outcomes for all sorts of people. So I think we have to take that on and be much smarter about that. But that also requires actually listening to your audience and responding in a real way, and not everyone does that well. Really.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that architects have created problems for themselves in some respects, and just thinking about the way that we communicate about architecture and buildings is quite relevant to that. But I guess one of the biggest issues for me in terms of perhaps looking at the value of architecture and has it been lost is this sort of question around the pressures on architecture within this sort of rising commercial environment. So things like Open House are fantastic, but we also have, if we just look and say what's had the biggest impact on Melbourne in the last 10 years as a city, it is commercial development. I mean, it's changed the city more than anything else. And we have lost a lot of respect in that market, and that's not necessarily by our fault, but it's all partly to do with the rise of intrusions on the market, such as project manager, for example. I mean, traditionally the architect was the lead consultant. We're still called the lead consultant so that we can be sued for everything. But we're not the lead consultant anymore. And project managers, and I mean, just to put this in perspective, to become an architect, you've got to do 5 years of study. you've got to work for a minimum of 2 years, you've got to fill out about 500 pages of logbooks, do a written exam and then do an oral exam to become registered, and then take out your PI insurance at an exorbitant rate. And then you get to be an architect and earn $37,000 plus super a year, about $45,000. Might be a bit more than that. I think the award went up recently. But if you want to be a project manager, you can take about 20 to 30% of the fee away from the architect, still force the architect into a lead consultant position through a form of procurement, and really have complete control over that project, and force the architect into a position in some situations to, on Friday night, just change the bloody drawings and draw what we're telling you to do. But that project manager doesn't have to have any qualifications at all. They've got no sort of... They're not bound professionally at all.
They have to know how to do an Excel spreadsheet.
They do know how to do an Excel spreadsheet. They used to love fax machines. But really they become a mailbox to some degree, and with no disrespect to project managers, because there are good project managers out there.
For that qualification.
There's a few in the crowd here tonight.
Any project managers who are in the audience?
Put your hands up. There are good project managers out there, in fairness, and when they do their job well, their services are fantastic. But there are a lot of cowboys out there as well. But also they see our space as a space that they can take over.
Which we relinquished.
Sorry.
And actually,
Architects relinquished.
Yeah.
We gave that away
by
not
so much of it.
performing. This was a while ago now, but we have to demonstrate. I mean, I'm not putting it all onto architects, but we do actually have to perform.
Well,
and we do. The thing people forget is we do
it.
We manage time, we manage money, and we manage design. So actually, we do this all the time. Just for some reason, we're not called the project manager.
No. But
we do it.
I wanted to come back to the point that architects aren't immune to the problem. They have to take responsibility for where we've let ourselves end up. And there's the last 10 years, and certainly when I talk to architects who've been around for 20 or 30 years, that architects have just progressively given more and more away. And we have to take responsibility. And the speech that I did at the awards was about that. I mean, when you set a fee, at the end of the day, you are the person who sets the fee, and you decide the scope of services that you'll provide for that fee and how well you will service that project. And if you set fees that you cannot provide the proper services, good services that an architect should do as a professional, for the fee that you offer, then you're creating the problem yourself, I guess. And I don't think that we can blame everyone else.
No,
I think
part of it's
about
that valuing of that innovative, creative thinking, though, which is so fundamental. And I'm sort of thinking of two sides of that in my experience within government. Of when we established the Office of the Victorian Government Architect, we spent a lot of time running around to departmental heads, trying to persuade them of the value of good design and why it was so important, that it's not that hard to ask for and you have to ask for it. And we were quite successful in lots of ways, and that was great. But then sometimes I'd get phone calls saying, "Oh, we got that ex-architect who's got this, great name and does this fantastic work, but everything is difficult all the time, and it's really hard to get the project through." And I'd sort of think, "Oh, come on, ex-architect, can you just behave and do your fantastic work, but just don't be too difficult?" But then the corollary of that is that I know lots of certain departments in government which will continually engage certain architects that they know will deliver on time, on budget, be very compliant, no problems, certainly won't go over time. So there's high professionalism, which is very important, but not a whole lot of innovation, which is very poor for public outcomes. So, and the problem with that is maybe it is more difficult. You do need more time. You need to invest in a process to get innovation, and that's worth it. You're getting something that's incredibly important, that's legacy out of that. So the architect doesn't have to be difficult, but there is an investment in that.
But can I just say too, though, I think it's a real risk to separate the creative architect from the ones who are compliant and deliver on time. I think there's a lot of examples, and I think people sitting here today would know that to be a good architect is not just about having extraordinary ideas, but it's about delivering them, and delivering them within commercial realities, commercial timeframes, etc. That is what we do. To make
no, totally right. I'm not wanting to suggest that that's not the case. But
I want to get away from the misery of architecture too. So,
this is a great part of it.
And when I talked about Melbourne being the underdog, what is incredible about architects in Melbourne is that they are so generous with their time. Like when I look at the amount of work that certain architects put into projects at the most minimal fees, I mean, it's do or die. You know, we care far more about what we leave behind than the fee at the end of the day, and that's part of the problem that we've got. But Melbourne architects, you know, under difficult planning circumstances, under very competitive fee situation at the moment, are producing the most incredible work, and I sort of captured that in the close of that speech that I did at the awards, where, you know, I was up there sort of as chapter president of the Institute in Victoria over 2 years. I had lots of people talking to me about all of these issues that we've discussed tonight. But then I go and present at the awards and introduce this incredible body of work that, you know, in most award systems, you just can't see that level of commitment. I mean, there's hardly... I mean, I've got to be careful what I say, but there's hardly a bad project. I mean, we had 230 projects entered in the Architecture Awards last year, and they were all an exceptional international standard, you know, an absolute commitment to good outcomes. So it's amazing, you know, how we kind of just get over it.
This might be the moment, John, to see if we have any questions out there. Now, we're going to privilege questions from caring, giving architects, from really, really difficult architects, and very brave project managers. So over to you.
Hi, I'm neither architect or project manager. One thing that's exercised my mind lately is the stock of mid to late mid-century, last century buildings that are being repurposed in Melbourne or revamped, like the Naru House with the cladding, World Trade Centre with that paint job, and some that are a risk, such as the National Bank building in Collins Street and that beautiful forecourt. What do you think should happen to those, and why are some of those buildings being altered in such a way you can't read the original architecture?
That's a heritage issue. I mean,
heritage had to come up, didn't it?
Yeah, well, heritage is incredibly important. I want to talk about heritage.
I was excited about talking about heritage.
So you should be.
Yeah. I think one thing to understand about Melbourne that is very different to many cities in the world, and you can say this about all of our cities really in Australia, is that we're a very young city. By the same token, we have some incredible buildings that were built. In Melbourne, the amount of money that was poured into buildings during the gold rush, for example, was absolutely phenomenal on an international scale. I mean, Melbourne was sort of an architectural identity for new buildings at the time. But I sort of always run the argument that as a young city, we are building our heritage. You know, we're only a couple of 100 years old, and when you look at sort of European cities, we're in a fundamentally different position. By the same token, we also have to play catch-up with this idea about buildings that are built for longevity and then buildings that are built for a lifespan. And even when we talk about new buildings now, if you sort of look at larger scale developments, we talk about 50-year life cycles for commercial buildings and 100-year life cycles for residential buildings. So, for example, some of the large glass towers that you see being built at the moment have a sort of approved, a designed 100-year life cycle. In other words, the thought is that maybe in 100 years they'll be pulled down again. So they're in timeframes compared to international or European cities, for example, they're just a small fragment of time. So in terms of us revisiting our heritage and understanding what has been fantastic projects that have been built in particularly the last 50 to 100 years, there's a lot of work for us to do in terms of trying to preserve buildings that people don't understand as heritage.
But also, your question, did you say Naru House? Was that one of the buildings you mentioned? So that's interesting because I'm pleased to hear someone talk about relatively recent heritage, which is absolutely, and that does take quite a while for people to figure out that actually relatively recent buildings can be valuable and worth retaining. So,
well, I think
it's a good
didn't Naru
question.
House have concrete cancer or something?
Did.
So they had to kind of rebuild the whole thing. But these kind of towers from the 60s and 70s, I mean, I live in one, and we're changing the lifts, we're redoing the air conditioning, we're doing a new facade on it, and it's a really expensive place to live because we're constantly changing things. And you get to the point where you look at it and say, well, actually, if we do just demolish the thing and start again, how will that work, and is that a viable option? And it starts to to look like that sometimes. I mean, I think a lot of these kind of modernist towers from the 60s, they need to be repurposed. They were symbols of a time where a bank might have built a building that had a certain philosophy. Things have changed. People want to be able to open a window. They want fresh air. They don't want to be in a cubicle. So they need to be refit as well.
There's a couple of things I want to comment on in relation to that. One is just the whole valuing and recognition of post-war heritage generally, which is incredibly important. And there's a couple of things, I suppose, well, in relation to that particularly, I know that, well, for example, Heritage Victoria, which is the government organisation in Victoria that registers, well, through with the Heritage Council's decision-making, registers buildings for their Victorian Heritage Register. You know, they have a massive backlog of nominations. Many of them are post-war heritage that they're just very under-resourced at the moment and can't get to them. So there's a long list of places. I mean, the fact that they're under-resourced is a travesty alone, so I think that needs to change. But the other thing is that there's a tendency to see heritage in a polarised way, and it's not very subtle and nuanced how we think about heritage. We tend to think it's got to be stuck in glass cases and dealt with kid gloves. That's not the case. There's actually very few buildings that have to be really preserved in that way, and some should be, of course, and aspects of them. But most buildings can be adapted very, very well using a good architect who's innovative and intelligent and sensitive, that actually can celebrate the original thing and really expose how wonderful it is. And I think there's a real issue and interested. I mean, I haven't worked in commercial development in the way you three have, but the issues of dealing with heritage in development, heritage is seen as a block. I mean, there are some countries where if you start digging for a commercial building, you discover an archaeological site, everyone's quite excited about it because it's an amazing thing. Here it's just a major drama and a disaster and a pain in the arse because it's going to hold the project up. I mean, you know, so there's again, back to the valuing, but also a more nuanced understanding of what good design is, I suppose, and what heritage is.
Another question.
Thank you. I've appreciated your discussion of the practical challenges that architects face. I was wondering if we could come back to the topic for tonight, which is creating a city with meaning. And I'd appreciate your interpretations of what that is and what a city with meaning would look like for each of you.
You've got 30 seconds each. Clearly, we've done a very poor job.
I'll have a go.
I'm apologetic about
the public spaces that I was talking about right back at the start. So richness in the public environment that's not just about beautiful architectural pieces, which are very important and special and defining, but fantastic public spaces. Our gardens, for example, the Trobes Gardens are extraordinarily important, and they are part of the whole picture. I just see it's more of a continuum, landscape and architecture and planning. They're all part of the same thing. So for me, it's about all those things. And the other one is the heritage I mentioned, a more nuanced and subtle discussion about those sorts of aspects.
Yeah. I think I'd probably add something about neighbourhoods. You know, I was talking before about a degree of tribalism in architecture, that there's a lot of different positions in this city, which I think is one of the most marvellous things about it and why it's such a great place to actually practice as an architect. So there's a parallel to the diversity of types of architecture being done and the need, I think, to maintain all of the different pockets of Melbourne as very distinctive pockets. You know, you tend to live in a particular place and work in a particular place and you realise you have quite a small radius every day and you know your neighbourhood really well, and then every now and then you end up in another little pocket of Melbourne, and the variation and the differences between those parts, I think, is something that is really absolutely fundamental to the richness that makes a city. So I would like to think that as architects we can somehow promote and amplify those fantastic character variations between one part and another, because I think that's a big part of what gives a city meaning. Yeah, attachment to one bit over another, and
For Melbourne, and I guess, you know, just to put it in context, I've grown up in Melbourne all my life. I've never lived anywhere else. For me, Melbourne is sort of art, and it's food and it's gardens, and it's not about buildings. And I think the buildings are a really important part of Melbourne, but fundamentally, I think that Melbourne's quietness and its small scale and its sort of intricate condition, and if we look at sort of what gets celebrated a fair bit, Melbourne's laneways, it's really reflective of the way that we come together as small communities. Like, walk through the Melbourne city at 10:30 at night, and then walk through Sydney at 10:30 at night. Fundamentally different, unbelievable. Like you're in two different countries. Sydney's just dead, and Melbourne's just absolutely vibrant. No matter how cold it is or whatever it might be. But it's an interesting condition. I think that open space is really important in Melbourne, and I am personally concerned, and that's not an institute position, but I'm personally concerned about the height of the buildings that are being built in Melbourne in close proximity to each other. I don't have a problem with height fundamentally, but when you build a big building with a lot of residences in it, I think that there is a lot of things that you need to think about beyond just how many car parks there are and how little you can do at the street frontage.
It's what Kerstin's point about character and identity, that if you're responsive to that, height's great in some places, not in others.
It is, but it also comes back to neighbourhoods. So, a building with 1,000 apartments is a neighbourhood in its own right, and that there should be communal spaces within that building. Arguably, if the building was 90 storeys, maybe one every 10 floors, where people can quickly get down to a space that they can kind of spread their wings, get out of their 45 square metre apartment and actually meet some other people if they choose not to go outside. But I think that for me in Melbourne is just sort of building on communities, building on neighbourhoods, and actually building on our cultural aspect. The whole idea of it being easy to get out of buildings, that good places to eat, good places to drink are close by, because it's sort of what we're about and what we celebrate with quite a mild climate, even though we have our hots and our colds, but we've got a great climate all year for being out and about. So that's where it sits for me.
It's worked out, Rodney. You've got the last word.
I take a bit from John and a bit from Kerstin and sort of agree with both points. For a future city, we need some, and from Shelley as well, we need some infrastructure.
You don't have to say that, it's okay.
She's a politician
I'm just
now.
thinking about my own situation, living in the city, and we seem to be talking about the city as the CBD, so I'll just run with that. But I live in the city, and I drive my kid to childcare in Brunswick because it's the closest place I can put him in, and then I drive back to North Melbourne, and there's this kind of insane reality that we're smacking up apartment buildings, but we're not getting these people to build any infrastructure around it. And I think that we need to, invest back into the public system, the public spaces, and get a little bit more chaotic with the mix of stuff we're putting in here. So it's not just all residential.
I think we have to finish there. We've filled the room. I think this conversation is one that could go on, and perhaps one that should happen on a more regular basis. I'm very grateful for the last question, which clearly addressed the topic in a way that we hadn't done to date. But I'd mostly like to thank our panellists for the wonderful job they did tonight. Thank you.